Imagine stepping onto a train in the 1800s. No air conditioning, no dining car, no onboard service. Coal smoke pours from the locomotive and blows straight into your face. The carriage shakes violently, your clothes smell like soot. And if you want a decent meal, congratulations, you may have just walked into a trap. At many train stations, passengers had only a few minutes to rush off and buy food. Some restaurants even worked with railroad staff to announce that the train was leaving earlier than it really was. Passengers who had just ordered food would panic, abandon their meals, and run back to the train. And the food they paid for? It was quietly taken back and sold again to the next unlucky traveler. Yet only a few decades later, those same railroad lines became home to white tablecloths, shining glassware, fine china, private chefs, and meals that could rival those served in luxury hotels.
From America's legendary Harvey Girls to Europe's glamorous Orient Express, the history of dining on trains is not just about food. It is a story of industry, money, class, marketing, travel, and the dream of turning an exhausting journey into a civilized experience. The train is one of the greatest symbols of industrial civilization. Its evolution followed almost every major technological leap of the modern age. Before the 19th century, there were primitive rail vehicles powered by human or animal force. Then came the steam locomotive, which used coal to turn heat into mechanical power. In the early 20th century, diesel locomotives appeared. Later came electric trains, and eventually the modern high-speed rail systems we know today. Every technological improvement made travel faster, smoother, and more comfortable. But alongside speed, people had another very simple need. They still had to eat. And when a journey lasted hours, days, or even crossed an entire continent, food was no longer a small detail. It became part of the travel experience itself. What makes the history of railroad dining so interesting is that train technology was driven mainly by engineering, but train food developed through a mix of culture, capital, service standards, branding, design, and commercial competition. In other words, the locomotive could take you farther, but the meal made you feel as if you were traveling like a civilized person. In the first half of the 19th century, eating on a train was often a miserable experience. Early passengers did not sit in comfortable, enclosed cars like modern travelers. Many early rail cars were nearly open to the air. They were noisy, smoky, and unstable. The steam engine threw out black smoke and coal dust, so passengers had to endure both the shaking of the car and the burning smell of the engine. At that time, steam trains had to stop for long periods at stations to take on water and fuel. Those stops became the only real chance for passengers to eat. Local vendors would climb aboard to sell simple foods, candy, fruit, or snacks. Other passengers would rush off the train and try to eat at a nearby tea room or station restaurant within 10 or 15 minutes. It sounds reasonable, but in reality, it was full of problems.
Most of these vendors and station restaurants did not care much about reputation. Their customers were only passing through once. That meant food could be poor, prices could be high, service could be slow, and travelers had little choice. Even worse, some restaurants deliberately took advantage of passengers. A customer would order a meal. Just as the food arrived, railroad staff would announce that the train was about to leave. The passenger, afraid of missing the train, would abandon the meal and rush back to the car. The restaurant would then take the untouched food back and sell it to the next group of travelers. For a long time, the safest way to eat while traveling by rail was to bring your own food from home. But that could not last forever. By the 1870s, one name began to change the way Americans ate while traveling by train: Fred Harvey.
Fred Harvey built a chain of restaurants designed specifically to serve railroad passengers. What made his idea different was branding. Instead of forcing passengers to gamble on unknown station restaurants, Harvey created a system with consistent standards, reliable service, and a reputation people could trust. Fred Harvey restaurants were clean, orderly, and elegant, They had linen tablecloths, proper china, glassware, and well-kept dining rooms. Many of the buildings were designed by respected architects, and some even became local landmarks. At a time when many railroad restaurants were little more than tourist traps, Fred Harvey offered something rare, quality at a fair price. The food was fresher, the service was faster, the prices were more reasonable. But food alone did not make Fred Harvey famous. A major part of the brand's power came from its celebrated female servers, the Harvey Girls. The Harvey Girls were usually young, respectable, unmarried women. They wore black dresses with white aprons and were trained to follow strict standards of service. For many women of the period, the job offered unusually good pay and a measure of independence. For male travelers in the American West, the image of a polite, well-dressed young woman serving a proper meal in a clean restaurant during a dusty railroad journey was unforgettable. It is no exaggeration to say that the Harvey Girls became the dream women of many American men of that era. And in fact, many of them did marry customers they met while working. Still, no matter how successful Fred Harvey became, the system of stopping at a station for a long meal eventually had to give way to something more modern, the dining car.
In the late 19th century, thanks in part to improvements associated with George Pullman, passengers could move more safely and easily between cars. That made the concept of a dedicated dining car much more practical. Instead of rushing off the train at a station, passengers could simply walk into another car, sit at a table, order food, and enjoy a meal while the train continued moving. A typical dining car kitchen of the period was tiny by restaurant standards, about 8 feet wide and 18 feet long. In that cramped space, 4 cooks might work together to prepare fresh meals for as many as 36 passengers. At the time, American railroad companies were fiercely competitive. They competed not only on routes, speed, and ticket prices, but also on experience. For wealthy passengers, the dining car became a powerful marketing tool. Railroad companies spent heavily to hire good chefs, buy quality ingredients, and create dining rooms that felt almost like first-class hotels or restaurants. And trains had one special advantage. They moved through many regions. That meant they could obtain local specialties along the route. This helped create some famous railroad dishes. One example was the giant baked potato served by the Northern Pacific Railway. These potatoes came from the Yakima Valley in Washington State. They were famous not only for their quality, but also for their extraordinary size. At the time, a typical large potato sold in the American market might weigh up to about 2 pounds, but some of these Washington potatoes could weigh as much as 5 pounds. The problem was that a potato that large was hard to bake evenly in a normal home oven. The outside might dry out or burn before the inside became soft. So the Northern Pacific Railway created a special baking method using a device similar to a rotisserie skewer, allowing heat to pass evenly through the potato. The result became a signature railroad dish. Another famous dish was cantaloupe pie. According to the story, several melon growers from the Texas coast were traveling by train and met a dining car chef. They eagerly promoted the quality of their cantaloupes, and the chef eventually created a new dessert from them. The dish was unusual. Peeled cantaloupe was mashed into a puree, then mixed with cream, gelatin, fresh orange juice, and sugar. It was not baked. Instead, it was chilled until it set into a cool, fragrant pie. But if one invention from railroad kitchens had the greatest impact on American home cooking, it was probably Bisquick. Bisquick is a pre-mixed bacon mix used for biscuits, pancakes, and many other baked foods. The idea began with a dining car chef who wanted to prepare meals more efficiently. He mixed lard, flour, baking powder, and salt in advance, then kept the mixture cold. When passengers ordered biscuits, he could bake them quickly. A sharp-eyed company manager noticed the trick and saw its commercial potential. After experimenting with the recipe, the formula was adjusted to include hydrogenated oil, meaning it no longer needed refrigeration. That product became Bisquick.
Afterward, Americans used it to bake almost everything. It truly changed American home cooking by making many recipes faster, easier, and more convenient. But even though railroad dining was widely admired, it could not escape history. In the early 20th century, the Great Depression and later World War II placed enormous pressure on passenger rail service. Dining cars were expensive to operate, complicated to manage, and often unprofitable. When companies needed to cut costs, dining service was one of the first areas to suffer. By the 1950s, airplanes and automobiles were rising quickly. Americans depended less and less on passenger trains for long-distance travel. As rail travel declined, the golden age of the elegant American dining car slowly faded from the stage. Across the Atlantic, however, the European railroad story developed differently. In 1869, the United States completed its transcontinental railroad at Promontory, Utah, linking east and west. But in Europe, rail development was far more complicated. Unlike the vast but relatively unified United States, Europe was a continent of kingdoms, empires, and nations. Each country had its own railway rules, systems, and standards. International rail travel was difficult.
The man who helped connect and elevate European rail travel was a young Belgian named George Nagelmakers. He was born on June 25, 1845 in Liège, Belgium, into a wealthy banking family. His father owned Nagelmakers Bank, one of Belgium's oldest private banks. George was, in every sense, a child of privilege, aristocratic background, money, education, and connections. But his path into railroad history began with a forbidden romance. At the age of 19, George told his father that he wanted to marry his cousin, a male cousin. In a traditional aristocratic Catholic family, such a relationship was unthinkable. To separate him from the attachment, his father sent him to America. No one expected that this exile would become the beginning of a career that transformed European luxury travel. During his 10 months in the United States, George traveled widely and encountered American sleeping cars. He quickly realized that eating and sleeping aboard trains could become the future of long-distance travel. But as a refined European aristocrat, he also found American sleeping cars crude and undignified.
They often had no toilets, no proper dining space, little privacy, and uncomfortable wooden sleeping arrangements. Ordinary passengers were packed into upper and lower berths with very little separation. To George's, this was not good enough for Europe's wealthy travelers. If elite Europeans were going to accept long-distance train travel, the train could not simply be transportation. It had to become a moving hotel. When he returned to Europe, George's founded the International Sleeping Car Company at only 25 years old. At first, major banks refused to finance him because the project seemed too risky, but he received support from King Leopold II of Belgium. The two lions in the company's emblem came from the Belgian royal connection. From the beginning, the International Sleeping Car Company had a clear identity. It was not designed for the masses. It was designed for the rich, the powerful, and the aristocratic. Passenger capacity was limited. At some stops, the train might carry only 6 to 20 passengers. This made it feel less like public transportation and more like a private club on wheels. That elite positioning allowed George's to do things no one else had done. His trains were among the first to attempt separate spaces for smokers and non-smokers. More importantly, they were among the first trains to have real kitchens and dining rooms.
Chefs prepared fresh meals on board in fully equipped kitchens. The train carried quality ingredients, wine, and other luxuries. At different stops, it could replenish supplies with local specialties. Service standards were extremely high. Staff members had to be polite, professional, friendly, and flexible. They did not only serve food, they could also act as ticket inspectors, room attendants, security, hotel staff, and even personal assistants. The food mattered, but the tableware mattered too. George's hired some of the best designers of the age to create custom dining equipment for his trains. Knives, forks, glasses, plates, porcelain, everything had to balance practicality with luxury. The attention to detail was astonishing. In the dining room, there were even special stands where passengers could place their pocket watches. With this level of service, the International Sleeping Car Company gradually built a powerful reputation. First came routes such as Austin to Berlin, and then Paris to Vienna. Once George's believed the moment was right,
he launched the most famous route of his career. On October 4, 1883, the Orient Express was born, running from Paris to Istanbul. And this was not merely a train, it was a media event. Georges Nagelmakers was a brilliant promoter. Before the train became famous, he filled streets with beautifully designed posters full of exotic Eastern imagery. The name Orient Express itself suggested mystery, luxury, and adventure. But he went even further. To make the first journey unforgettable and to ease fears about long-distance travel, he reportedly hired fake bandits for the inaugural trip. At first they appeared threatening and frightened the passengers. Then, suddenly, they pulled out musical instruments and began performing and dancing. The passengers experienced the thrill of danger without real danger. The newspapers loved it. The Orient Express instantly became a story people wanted to talk about. On another occasion, when the train broke down near Bucharest, Romania, Georges did not leave the passengers sitting around in frustration. He turned the delay into a short excursion and took them to visit a nearby Romanian castle. A mechanical failure became a travel experience. At last, after overcoming difficulties, the first Orient Express reached Istanbul, then part of the Ottoman Empire. For many Western travelers in the 19th century, the Ottoman world felt mysterious and exotic. Its clothing, religion, architecture, customs, and daily life seemed very different from Western Europe. To sit in a luxurious train, cross the borders of several countries, and arrive in Istanbul was almost mythical. It is hard to imagine what those first passengers felt as they crossed the Galata Bridge, saw Hagia Sophia, and entered a city that stood between Europe and Asia. The arrival of the Orient Express also led to famous buildings. Sultan Abdul Hamid II ordered the construction of a beautiful railway station in 1890 to welcome the train. In 1892, the Para Palace Hotel was completed to accommodate wealthy Orient Express passengers.
Many years later, in room 411 of that hotel, the writer Agatha Christie is said to have worked on her legendary detective novel, Murder on the Orient Express. From then on, the Orient Express was no longer just transportation. It became a symbol of mystery, luxury, espionage, aristocracy, crime, and literary imagination. The International Sleeping Car Company later grew into a railroad empire. It owned around 1,000 sleeping cars, employed more than 6,000 people, and operated routes reaching Russia, North Africa, and even Beijing. The company also became tied to major moments in European political history. After World War I, Germany signed the armistice with the Allied powers in a rail car belonging to the company. Years later, when Hitler forced France to surrender, he deliberately brought out the same rail car as an act of symbolic revenge.
For the International Sleeping Car Company, all of this fine dining, luxury travel, literature, politics, and history only added to its legend. So the next time you eat a simple meal on a train or sip coffee during a long trip, remember this. Behind that small meal is more than 200 years of history. A history that began with coal smoke, station scams, and hurried meals on the platform, and eventually reached white tablecloths, sparkling glasses, elegant dining cars, and the legendary Orient Express, where dinner on the rails could feel like stepping into a movie before cinema had even learned how to tell that story.